don't play it at home alone at night.
I think it's all about the zombies, I'm sorry to say.
This is the end of the world. This is a zombie apocalypse.
I was like so in love with the game that I really wanted to make it into a movie.
Video games offer a real experience of being in a situation that doesn't exist in any other medium. When you are doing a video game, it's really you there, and you really feel like you went through that experience.
Video games give fans an opportunity to be part of the story, and obviously it's interactive, and it's much longer. You can be part of a much longer narrative. And it's kind of a wish fulfillment fantasy thing, I think, for fans, that they can assume another persona and immerse themselves in a fantasy world. As gaming has become more sophisticated, and as gaming platforms have become more sophisticated, the games have evolved from being simply puzzles or shooters or fighting things into stories and to immersive worlds.
Okay, let me handle this.
Filmmakers lift from everything, and they're going to lift from whatever source is really turning on the demographic that they're going for. Action!
The first to use video game technology is pretty obvious. It's Tron. I mean, it's really well known, and it's a complete cult film in our industry. Everyone that I work with loves Tron. Tron, I think, was completely playing off the idea of what you could do technically with video games, and also was the first idea where they said, we're going to make a movie and we're going to tie it in with video games, and they did that very effectively.
I made a movie called Mortal Kombat, and after that film opened at #1 in America, I got offered a lot of other adaptations of video games.
People in the video game business really liked Mortal Kombat because it was probably the first movie that took a video game and made it, really made it happen on the screen.
Resident Evil was, it's a Japanese game, and in Japan it's called Biohazard. It's hugely successful. It's sold, I think it's something like 16, 17 million copies. And there are 5 separate Resident Evil games now. It really took like 2 months of my life. I just got obsessed with playing this game, and I didn't do anything other than that.
The thing about Resident Evil that makes it suitable for a feature film is that it is unpredictable. You do not know what is around the corner. Therefore, it will make it exciting to an audience in the cinema. It has at its center a true evil, and evil is always very dramatic.
This house is dangerous. There are terrible demons. Ouch!
The third thing is that there is something very personal about it. The experience of playing Resident Evil is like literally being in that mansion and having to fight all those mutants. It's not impersonal like it is in some of the driving games where you're simply trashing cars. This has more depth to it.
It's always been kind of seen as like a cinematic game, which always lends itself to the movie very well. And the movie, the great thing about the movie though was that it captured, pretty much what makes this game great.
I love the feeling of stillness about it, how it's just empty, and then you'll turn a corridor and suddenly be attacked by all these zombies, and it's something about that really I just found exciting.
I think what attracts me most about the game is the fact that once you get into it, it is like being in a Hitchcock film because of the silence involved and the mansions and the quietness and the stillness of your surroundings, and knowing that there's zombies out there, and knowing that you're in the midst of danger all the time.
The first game has a set of characters, and then the sequel actually follows a completely different set of characters in a different location. You know, they're not in a mansion in the woods anymore, they're in a nearby city, Raccoon City, which is all abandoned. When you look at all the games taken together, you know, it was a really wide range of characters in different locations following different storylines. And that kind of made an adaptation extra challenging because, you know, if you go and do an adaptation of Resident Evil 1, you risk alienating all the people who love Resident Evil 2 and the characters from Resident Evil 2. So if you're watching a straight adaptation of Resident Evil 1, the game, there's no suspense. You know who's going to live, who's going to die, you know what the story is. And I felt that would make a very unsatisfying adaptation because why not just go and play the game again? The idea I came up with was to do a prequel. In the very first game, you go into the woods and there's a mansion, and below it is a high-tech research facility. And it's all overrun with undead and mutants and creatures, but it's never really explained what's happened. You know, the backstory to that is never really explained. And that's what the movie does, is the movie kind of is the lead-up, is the prequel to the very first game.
The T-virus escaped into the air conditioning system, and an uncontrolled pattern of infection began. The virus is protean, changing from liquid to airborne to blood transmission.
And in that way, it stays very true to the universe of the game, and it also expands upon that universe. So in a way, it's almost like another game.
No pressure, guys. You require the 4-digit access code. I can give you the code, but first you must do something for me.
And that was our approach, was to try and develop the movie as though it were just another Resident Evil game. Although the setting's familiar to people who know the game, the story isn't familiar. So whether you're a gamer or a non-gamer, you're starting from the same level. You don't know what the hell's going on. So in many ways, the prequel really was, I think, the ideal way to approach the adaptation. The games have certain archetypes of characters. You know, they quite often focus on very, very strong female characters, young female characters. And that's why the movie focuses on Mila and Michelle Rodriguez, you know, and they are playing archetypes from the game, there's no doubt about that. Mila's not called Jill Valentine, but in her mind and in my mind, that's what she was playing. She was absolutely playing that kind of character. Also, the structure of the game is interesting, that when you enter a new room, you cut to a black screen and a set of doors open. And as you're playing, there's that moment of like anticipation, because you have no idea what's going to be in that room, whether it's going to be a load of undead that attack you, or whether it's going to be something that's going to help you. And it's really very suspenseful. One of the things we did was we structured the movie. If you go back and watch the film again, there's a hell of a lot of doors opening in this film. The Red Queen's an entirely new character that's just created for the movie.
You're all going to die down here.
What happens in the game is you get told a lot of the story as you go through the game by reading journals that you find lying around. So there's a lot of reading in the game. You know, you're like reading books, reading reports, typing computer screens, reading the computer screen, and that can make for incredibly dull cinema. So we had to find a different way to convey a lot of the narrative. So I came up with the idea that we should have a computer, but one that could talk.
The T-virus was a major medical breakthrough, although it clearly also possessed highly profitable military applications.
The movie is shot a little like the video game. There are these great down angles where you look into rooms, look down on top of people. And, you know, whenever I had a chance to do a shot like that, we'd do it. And that's an angle that is straight out of the video game. I mean, that's an angle that's very familiar to any kind of gamer. So in many ways, you know, the feel of the game was put into the movie. The only one consistent creature that's been in every single one of the games are the zombie dogs. When people discovered I was making the movie, fans would always be the first question they ask. Is, are the dogs in the film? Are the dogs in the film? So it became obvious the dogs had to be in the film. It takes a lot from a whole genre of movies which I'm a huge fan of, which are the Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, and Day of the Dead, that trilogy that Romero did. And not only those, but also the Lucio Fulci movies. That's what attracted me to the game, was not only is it a very strong game, to make a movie out of it was a chance to reinvent a movie genre that just hadn't been done for 20 years.
The first zombie movies came around, you know, they were the voodoo zombie kind of films from the early 30s. I Walked with a Zombie, White Zombie, and old movies like that. And in the original zombie movies, it wasn't so much you had to kill the zombies, it was you have to kill whoever is in charge of the zombies. And back in the day, it was the zombies were very mindless, and they weren't eating people. They weren't doing any of that. They were just, you know, they'd go and strangle. It was like having an army of mummies, but you only ever had like 8 people. The idea behind Night of the Living Dead was these people aren't like vampires. They're not going to suck your blood. They're going to eat your flesh. They are going to actually tear into your flesh and like eat the musculature and stuff like that. This was totally new, and it was sick, and it was considered completely demented.
The rules of Romero's movies, you know, were picked up very much by the video game. So we were sticking true to the rules of the video game. The universe of the video game is, you know, it's very explicit. You know, there are certain rules, there are certain things you have to obey. You can't have fast-moving zombies, for example. You know, they've got to move at a certain pace. We were actually staying true to the rules that were set up in the video game rather than Romero's movies, although the video game was obviously heavily influenced by his films.
While the story of the movie doesn't exactly follow the story of any particular game, like the first Night of the Living Dead, the first game is kind of claustrophobic. It's kind of like you fighting terror alone. And the second game, like the second Night of the Living Dead movie, Dawn of the Dead, is sort of more post-apocalyptic, and now you're dealing with kind of a world where everything has broken down.
When I became involved in the movie, I made it very clear that I wanted to make an R-rated film. I mean, there was never any question of that in my mind, because I think to be true to the video game, there was no way you could make this into a PG-13 movie.
Bitch isn't standing now.
And I knew it would become a battle at some point, because PG-13 movies can play to a broader audience and can make more money. So at some point, you always get the question, can't we make this a PG-13? For us to have made a PG-13 Resident Evil, the fans would have hated us. And I would have hated us as well, because that wouldn't have been Resident Evil. We couldn't have stayed true to the source material.
Politicians and people who have particular social agendas tend to blame whatever is popular at the time for whatever social problem seems intractable at the time. In the 50s, it was comic books. 60s and 70s, it was television. And in the 80s, it was violent films. And now it's video games.
I think it's kind of absurd to try and look at a movie like Resident Evil and say, all these guys shooting guns at zombies, which is a fantasy, is going to affect our kids. But George Bush is blowing up another country right now, and that's not going to affect the kids.
Video games change the language of films the way that other visual media have. Computers have allowed creative people to fulfill their wildest dreams and visions, and video games are one of those things. I think films have evolved and are continually evolving depending on the times.